Welcome to the HTML5 project training series. I'm Mike King, your host, and in this tutorial we're going to look at 2D and 3D transformations part 2 of this series. And in this particular exercise, or part 2 of the exercise, we'll be looking at the following methods. We're going to look at the SkewX method, which skews an element along the x-axis by the given angle that we actually put in the parameters. We're going to look at the SkewY method, which skews an element along the y-axis by the given angle that we set up into the parameters. We're going to look at the Skew method itself, which is the Skew method skews an element along the x and the y-axis by giving both the angles into a single or shortcut method called the Skew method. And then we're also going to look at the matrix method. This method combines all the 2D transformations that we've looked at up to this point, all 6 parameters, which includes our rotate, our scale, our move or translate, and the skew elements, and it combines them all into one element so we can do all of those simultaneously with what's called the matrix method in CSS3. So let's go ahead and move into our development environment and demonstrate the methods that we'll be demonstrating in this exercise. All right, so let's go ahead and minimize our presentation and get into our development environment. First thing I want to do is I want to confirm that my Apache server is up and running, which it is. I'm going to go ahead and load up Google Chrome, which will be the browser I'm going to use for the default for this exercise, and my Sublime Text 2, which will be my text editor for this exercise. And you'll notice I've got my HTML_start file loaded with my SkewX method loaded as default. That's the actual one I've got loaded up in my browser also. You can actually go into the root if you want to see that. I've got the actual start file loaded right there. All right, so the first thing I want to do is we're going to look at, the first one we're going to look at is the SkewX method inside of our 2D transformation. So the SkewX method skews an element along the x-axis by the given angle that we actually put in the parameters. So we're actually going to go ahead and set one up so that you can see what I mean by this. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as on this file. Let's go ahead and save this as example1.html. And then what I want to do is I want to go ahead and add some elements to my body inside the body element. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and give it a heading. So I'm going to add an H1 heading inside here. And it's just going to be called the SkewX method. And then right below that I want to add a paragraph. I'm going to come down right below my heading 1 and add a paragraph. And it's going to be the SkewX method skews an element along the x-axis by the given angle that we actually set up in the parameters. And you're going to see that in a few minutes. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in a section right below that paragraph. And this is going to just be a normal section. This section, this is a normal div element without any skew element or without any skewing added to that particular element. And then I'm going to add another section right below it that actually is going to be the section that we're going to skew. So I'm going to come right below that section. I'm going to add my next section. And you notice I've got a paragraph element in that one also. And it tells me this div element is going to be skewed 45 degrees along the x-axis. And you'll notice I've given that a class of SkewX. Now would be a great time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and load up my example_1.html, refresh it in my browser window right after I save all these changes so that you can actually see what we've got in the browser window. So I've got my 3 paragraphs of text. 2 of those are enclosed inside section headings or section elements. And now we're going to go ahead and add some styling to the head section of my document so we can actually demonstrate this SkewX inside of CSS3. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a couple style tags. I have my opening tag, come down a few lines, put my closing style tag up in there. And then inside my style tags, I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. Inside my style tag, the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and address both of our sections so that we can actually see how those are going to be formatted. I'm going to go ahead and put in my section element with my opening and closing curly braces. And the first thing I want to do, let's give them a width. I'm going to give them a width of 300 pixels. Stop that with a semicolon. I'm going to give them a height of 100 pixels. And that with a semicolon. Let's give them a margin left. And the reason I'm putting a margin left is here because of the skew. I don't want it to go off our browser, the viewable area. So I'm just going to give it a 25 pixel margin left. That's going to keep everything in our viewport for us so that we can see it. I'm going to give it a background color of aqua. And I'm going to put a border on it. Let's go ahead and add a border, 1 pixel, solid, and gray. And the only reason I'm adding these borders and the background colors, obviously, I want them to stand out so you can see how these things are being manipulated. When you're actually setting up your own site, a lot of this stuff you probably won't have in yours. Again, I'm just doing the colors and these borders so that you can actually see what's occurring as we play with these methods inside CSS3. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. I'm going to go ahead and refresh our browser window so you can actually see what we've done here. You'll notice now we've got our 2 section elements, given them a light background. We've got our text in there. And now in order to actually set up skewing for our second section, I actually have to go to this class that I set up, a class of SkewX. And we're going to address that right now in our style tags. And we're actually going to skew that one particular element. So I'm going to address my section with a class of SkewX. And you'll notice I've got the dot. That signifies that we're targeting a class. Now inside CSS, I want to do a transform, put in my semicolon or my colon, and I'm going to say SkewX. And inside my parentheses, I'm going to say 45 degrees because that's going to be our first demonstration. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to skew our section element 45 degrees. And I also want to put in here, by the way, this is our standard syntax for the skew. And if we did have to put in the fallbacks for the other browsers or for older type browsers, this would be the last one we'd enter, obviously, because this is the standard syntax. Let's go ahead and save those changes, refresh our browser window, and you can actually see now that that second section has been skewed by 45 degrees along the x-axis. If I were to set this up at 30 degrees, so whatever degree we happen to have set up in here is how this is going to skew based on whatever settings we put inside these parameters. If I only wanted it 15 degrees, again, it's just going to look at the view inside the parameter and set up the skewing on the x-axis based on that view. You'll see the same thing when we get into the next demonstration where we actually skew the y-axis. I'm going to go ahead and put this back to 45. The reason being because we're going to put the fallback in there, and I want you to see again that we do have fallback if we need it for the older browsers. I'm going to go ahead and grab this. So I'm going to come right in my SkewX, and again, because I want the standard syntax to be last, I always put the fallback above. So it's going to be MS, so dash MS dash, and again, transform SkewX. So it's the same syntax, I'm just preceding it with the fallback code for the web rendering engines. So it's MS dash transform SkewX, and then again, inside my parentheses, 45 degrees. And that with a semicolon, once I come out of the parentheses, that's for Internet Explorer 9. I'm going to copy that same line, come down right below that because we have the WebKit rendering is the same thing except we just replace the MS with WebKit. And again, transform, SkewX 45 degrees, save all these changes. Now we can actually support the older browsers, and obviously the WebKit is for our Safari browsers. So we can support those changes in the Safari browsers. If I save this, update my browser, again, you'll see that we're good to go with our skewing. I am going to go back to 15 degrees to let you know that all the newer browsers are supporting this. So I'm going to save that change, refresh the browser window, then let's go ahead and test this in our older browsers. I'm going to go ahead and bring up Opera first. Let's go ahead and bring up Opera. Let's go ahead and refresh this. Go to example 1. You'll notice that Opera does support it. I'm going to go ahead and bring it up in Firefox. Let's go ahead and refresh, bring up example 1. Firefox also supports it. Going to close that one out. Let's go ahead and close out Opera. Let's go ahead and bring up Internet Explorer. Again, refresh the browser window, load example 1, and you'll see the Internet Explorer also supports it. And the one we've used throughout the demonstration, obviously, is Google Chrome. And we know that Google Chrome is supporting it. That's the one we've been using throughout our demonstrations. The reason I went back to 15 degrees is so you could tell that we were actually loading the standard syntax and it wasn't using the fallback syntax for the web rendering engines. So I hope that explains SkewX. The next thing we're going to look at, we're actually going to go look at the SkewY method inside CSS3 using our transform property. All right, so we went ahead and looked at that SkewX method. Now let's go ahead and look at the SkewY method. I'm going to go ahead and do save as on this. I want to save this as example_2.html. And I'm going to go ahead and remove this code. I'm going to change our title to SkewY Method. Remove the HTML code from inside our body element and go ahead and save those changes. Let's go ahead and go back, refresh, and load up example number 2, which now gives us a nice blank screen to start with. So I want to go ahead and enter the following HTML code. Let's go ahead and first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and put in an H1 and my first paragraph of text, very similar to what we've done in the last exercise, just calling it the SkewY method. And then I'm going to put a paragraph. The SkewY method skews an element along the y-axis by the given angle that we set up in the parameter. And then I want to put 2 sections in, just like we did in the previous demonstration. But these sections are going to pertain to SkewY instead of SkewX. And you'll notice I've got a section. Let me go ahead and get some of these blank spaces out. I've got a section with a paragraph that says this is a normal section element that will contain the text that will not be skewed. And then I've set up another section and I've given a class of SkewY, and that has a paragraph in there that says this section element is skewed 40 degrees along the y-axis in the first example. And this is the one we're actually going to play with as we set up the skewing. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes, refresh my browser window to get those paragraphs in. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in. Because now what I want to do is I want to come down and actually do some styling. So you see what the paragraphs look like before we start doing any styling. Then we're going to go and do the same thing we've done with the previous exercise. I'm going to go up in my style tags. I want to come down and put in our section, my opening and closing curly braces, because what I'm going to do right now is style both our sections so they look similar before we start anything. I'm just going to give them a width, 300 pixels. And again, I'm doing most of this so just so it's easier for us to see inside the browser window, inside my development environment. I'm going to go ahead and give them a height of 100 pixels. I'm going to go ahead and give them a background color of aqua. I like that background color. And then I'm going to give them a border. Let's give them a border of 1 pixel, solid. And I'm just going to give them the nice gray color that we tend to use a lot. Let's go ahead and save those changes, refresh our browser window. And you can see now we've got our 2 section elements set up inside of our aqua containers. And again, I've done this with the borders and with the color so that you can actually see the skewing as it's taking effect. I'm going to go ahead, good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type that in. Because what I want to do now is I want to actually add the SkewY so you can see what occurs as we skew the Y on this particular demonstration. So I'm going to come right down below the section curly brace. I'm going to put in another section. And again, this time I'm looking at the class that has a class of SkewY. So I'm going to go ahead and put my period, SkewY, open and closing curly braces. And now we're specifically targeting this section with the class of SkewY. And again, very similar to what we did with SkewX, I'm going to say transform. Put my colon, SkewY. And then inside my parentheses, I'm going to go ahead and add the degrees. For this first example, we're going to say 40 degrees. We want to skew that along the y-axis. I'm going to go ahead and save those changes, refresh my browser window, and you can see now what a 40-degree skew looks like on that y-axis for that this particular demonstration. And again, it works just as the others with negative numbers. I could put a -40, save the change, refresh the browser window, and it just reverses. You'll notice that our line is staying lined up. I mean, we're just skewing that y-axis. We're not doing anything with the x-axis yet. Let's go ahead and make this 20-degree skew, which would be a little more palatable as far as being able to read it. Now you can see that 20-degree skew, and you'll notice also that the text is taking on that skew angle also. And that's an important concept to remember as you're doing this, that the text will pick up the skew angle just as the container does. Anything that's inside that container is going to pick up that skew on whether it's the x-axis or the y-axis. So now we've got a 20-degree, and again, I've demonstrated that we can do negative and positive numbers. And just like our previous demonstrations, I'm going to go ahead and test this in our separate browsers. So we've done our demonstration in Google Chrome. Let's go ahead and bring up Opera. You can see that Opera also treats it the same way. If I bring it up in Internet Explorer, we've got the same thing. And if I bring it up in Firefox, Again, same thing, but again, you'll notice with Firefox, we've got a slightly larger text for the default text in Firefox. So all the browsers, again, are supporting the transform very well, the SkewY transform very well. Older browsers, we actually have older browsers. We actually do have fallback, just like we had done in the previous exercises. Let me go ahead and type in first the Microsoft. So I put my -ms- and then transform SkewY, same terminology that we use for the actual standard syntax we actually use for the Microsoft syntax. And again, I'm going to copy it because the WebKit is the exact same thing. Come down, paste that one, and it's just WebKit transform : SkewY. And that's the actual WebKit transform SkewY. So again, very, very similar to what we did with the SkewX. It does work very well across the browsers. And the next one we're actually going to look at now, we actually have a method that allows us to skew both with a single method, and that's called the Skew method. Without using an X or a Y, we can actually use the Skew method that allows us to skew both with the same method, and that's the one we're going to look at next. All right, so now let's look at a method where we can actually do the SkewX and the SkewY in the same method. I'm going to go ahead and do save as. Let's go ahead and just save this, and I'm going to save this as example_3.html inside your exercise files folder. I'm going to go ahead and remove this existing code. I'm going to go ahead and remove all this code, except I'm going to go ahead and, I think I'm going to leave that section styling in there. Yeah, take it all out. Let's take it all out. Go ahead and save those changes to example_3. And the first thing I want to do is let's go ahead and add some HTML code inside of our body element. Keep in mind the Skew method skews an element along the X and the Y axis by the given angles that we actually put into the parameters. In the following example, I'm going to go ahead and skew our section element 10 degrees along the X axis and 20 degrees along the Y axis for our first demonstration. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and put in my H1 in my paragraph tag as we've been doing in the previous exercise. I just want to give myself a heading that talks about the Skew method. That's the one we're actually going to look at. My paragraph text says the Skew method skews an element along the X-axis and the Y-axis by the given angles that we set up in the parameters. Then I'm going to go ahead and build a couple of sections into my HTML document. My first section, as we've done in our previous exercises, will not be skewed. So that first section contains a normal section element that will contain text that will not be skewed, so we can compare it to the other element. And then my second section is going to have a class of skew. I'll give you 1 second here. Let me get this in, and I'll give you guys a second to get this all typed in if you want. Enter it into your text editor. Let me go ahead and save these changes. So the second section is going to have a class of skew. This section element is skewed 10 degrees along the X-axis and 20 degrees along the Y-axis in the first example. This is skew text based on the skew class definition that we're actually going to put up in our styles. I'm going to go ahead and save these changes. Let's go ahead and load this up in our example. So you can see our 3 paragraphs. Great time. Let me pause up or scroll up a little bit. Great time to pause if you want to type all that in. We've got our paragraphs now displayed inside of our browser window. So now let's go ahead and set up our first section. So we're going to go ahead and set up that first section in our styling as we've been doing in the past, so that we can differentiate these once we see them in our browser. I'm going to go ahead and bring in this first section. Let's go ahead and clean up my formatting here. I'll give you a second to type this in 1 moment. And this is where we actually set up the 2 sections. So we have our background, our border. We've been doing this all along. You should be pretty used to it now. I've given these a width of 350 though. I've actually increased the width a little bit on this particular example. I'm going to go ahead and save all the changes, refresh our browser window so you can actually see now what our 2 boxes look like. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. And again, we've been doing this all along. We've been setting up these sections so that they have a background and a border so that you can actually see as we set up the skew. So let's go ahead and put in our first skew. And this is very similar to what we've already been doing. The only difference is this time I'm actually addressing both of them inside the same skew command. So I've got my skew method set up, and now I've got my X-axis and my Y-axis in the same command. So I'm going to skew 20 degrees on the X and 10 degrees on the Y. When I save those changes, and again, it's a shortcut for the skew method. If we're going to use both, this is one way we can do it. Save those changes, refresh my browser window. You can actually see now that we've got an X and a Y. What's neat with the shortcut method is, as you can imagine, if I wanted to just skew on the Y, I could make that 0 degrees. Save the change, refresh my browser window, now I only have a Y skew. If I only wanted an X skew, I could make this 0 and make this 20 degrees or 10 degrees or whatever. Save that change, refresh my browser window. Now I've only got 20 degrees on my X and my Y is 0. So we can actually use the shortcut method, which is the Skew method, is actually the shortcut for SkewX and SkewY. We could actually use this for all of them. Because technically, if I didn't want an X or I didn't want a Y, I could just put a 0 in that field. I do have to have both fields filled in though. I can't leave it blank. So I do have to have both fields filled in, but I could put a 0 in one of the fields if I wanted to just skew it on the X or the Y itself. But the Skew method allows me to do both at the same time, so I don't have to use the individual commands. Pretty cool, I kind of like it. We've got the same fallback. Let's go ahead and look at our other browsers first though, because again, like all of our other ones, so far all the current browsers are supporting this. Let me go in here and refresh and load up example 3. Opera supports it, just as we figured it would. Let me go ahead and bring up Firefox, go back and reload that example 3 file. Firefox supports it. Again, keep in mind the text, again, because of the default text size in Firefox is a little larger, you may have to make some adjustments to the box itself, or I would recommend a CSS reset to get everything set to the same parameters as all our browsers. We also have the same thing, Internet Explorer will support it. Let me go ahead and refresh, go to example 3, Internet Explorer supports it also. So again, it's supported across the browsers. We do have fallback code, like we've talked about with the previous examples. Let me go ahead and bring it in. The fallback code for Microsoft rendering engine is -ms dash, and again, same commands. It's transform, :skew, and then we put in our degrees. So it works the same way with the Microsoft rendering engine, and we can do the same thing with WebKit. Same command. So the commands haven't changed with the WebKit rendering engine. The only thing I have to change here is WebKit. So if you want it to work on the older browsers, you can actually use the fallback code. Again, always make certain that the last one you enter for standard syntax is the actual standard syntax code, because that's the one you would want last. So it goes through and looks to see if it needs those first. If it doesn't, it falls back to the standard. The next one we're going to look at is a little bit more interesting, and it's also a lot more complicated. We're actually going to drop back into our presentation for a minute, because we're actually going to look at the two-dimensional matrix method. And this actually allows us to combine all the two-dimensional ones that we've discussed up to this point. That's the SkewX, SkewY, Skew, plus all the ones that we addressed in the first portion of the tutorial, which were the scale method, the rotate method, and the translate method. So all of those can be put into the matrix method. So I want to drop back into the presentation really quick to talk about how it's set up, and then we'll do a demonstration of how it works in CSS3. All right, so let's drop out of our development environment and head back into our presentation real quick so we can talk about matrix. And in 2D transforms, we have what's called the matrix method. This method combines all the 2D transform methods into one complete method. So the matrix method takes all 6 parameters containing mathematical functions which allow us to rotate, scale, move or translate, and skew elements into one method, so we don't have to use the individual ones. And it looks something like this. It'll have transform matrix, and then we'll have 6 values inside the parentheses. Matrices are transforms like RGB hex codes are to colors. So matrices are to transforms like RGB hex codes are to colors. They are representations that are easy for computers to understand, but not so much for human beings to understand as to how they get these actual values. There are some very, very good articles on how they actually get the matrix values and the transforms for CSS3. It's very complex, way outside the scope of what we're going to teach in this class. I'm going to demonstrate a couple of them in the tutorial, but I think I may actually do a tutorial just on the 2D and 3D matrix, because it probably would take about an hour or two just to go through all the different values and how they're actually acquired. But the one thing I do want you to understand is, sure, web designers can use the rotate, skew, scale, and translate functions individually to fulfill their transformation needs. So why should we bother with the matrix at all? There are a few cases when you'd actually want to use the matrix, and one of them happens to be speed or precision. If you want to be very, very precise with your transforms, you can be much more precise using the matrix itself to actually come up with these values. And again, that's why I think I'm going to go ahead and do individual tutorials on the 2D matrix and the 3D matrix in CSS3. But now let's go ahead and move back into our development environment so we can go ahead and demonstrate using the transformation matrix in CSS3. All right, so let's go ahead and move back into our development environment where we can go ahead and demonstrate the matrix method, CSS3. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of our presentation. I've still got my example 3 loaded up. I'm going to go ahead and do a save as on this particular file and save this as example_4.html. And then I want to go ahead and remove the existing code. So I'm going to go ahead and grab all the code that we had in there from the previous exercise and just go ahead and get rid of it. And now we've got all this nice blank document for our example 4 and go ahead and save those changes to our example 4. I'm going to go back here and let's go ahead and reload example 4 in our document window. And the first thing I'm going to do is let's go ahead and change our title to the matrix method, so it appears at the top of our page. Save that change. Refresh our browser. Now we have the matrix method up on our tab. So remember that the matrix method combines all the 2D transformation methods into one method. The matrix method takes 6 parameters containing mathematical functions, which allows us to rotate, scale, move, which is actually translate, and then skew the elements. So let's go ahead and enter the HTML sections that we'll need to make this work. I'm going to go ahead and copy these and put these into our HTML body tags. Once we get everything set up, I'll go ahead and pause so you can type it in. You'll notice I've given ourselves an H1 header called the matrix method. Then it just have this paragraph. The matrix method combines all the 2D transformation methods into one. The matrix method takes the 6 parameters containing mathematical functions, which allows us to rotate, scale, move, translate, and skew the element. Then I'm going to go ahead and set up 3 sections inside our document. And the first section is just going to be a normal text section like we've done in our previous exercises. This one will not be affected by what we're going to do with the CSS3. And it's just a normal section. Then I'm going to actually have 2 sections that are actually going to be affected by our CSS coding. My first section is going to have a class of matrix 1, and then my second section is going to have a class of matrix 2. And those are the ones that we're actually going to target with our CSS3 code as we set up and perform our demonstrations. So let's go ahead and save those changes in example 4. I'm going to go ahead and refresh our browser window so you can see that stuff come up in the window. Good time to pause if you want to go ahead and type this in for the demonstration. Great, so the next thing I want to do now is let's start adding our styling. And just like we've done in the past, we're going to embed the styling and style tags in the head section of our document. And I'm going to go ahead and style our section elements separately so that we can actually get them set up. So I'm going to go up into my style tags, and I'm going to set up a section element, and I'm going to give it a width, a height, a background, and a border. And this is very similar to what we've been doing in the past. And this is just to give some clarity to our section areas so we can actually identify them on our browser window. Let me go ahead and save those changes, refresh the browser, and you'll see now that we've got 3 sections set up that have a border and a background color so that we'll be able to see exactly what's occurring as we set up the settings for these 2D transformations. Good time to pause if you want to type that in. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and set up the first section with the class of matrix 1. And in here we're actually going to do some impacting on the skew angle of this particular section element. You'll notice I've got my section set up with my class of matrix 1, and that's how I've identified it down here inside the section with the class tag. I've got my transform matrix, and then in my parentheses I've got my 6 figures. I've got my 1 figure to make it active, then I've got my figures that start actually setting up how we want this one to transform on our browser, inside our browser window. And again, like I said in the presentation, this is a very complex set of mathematical equations. There are some things that you can go in to read on how to do this, but I mean, it's something way outside the scope of this particular tutorial to explain exactly how these calculations work. But they do work, they are fast, They're much quicker than using the individual ones. And actually, like I said earlier, I think I will do a tutorial on the matrix, both the 2D transformation matrix and the 3D transformation matrix, which actually requires 16 values, because then we get into the z-index also. And I think I will actually do a tutorial on how these are actually calculated. But when I go ahead and save these changes, refresh our browser window, you'll see we've got that first set of skewing now for our matrix 1. I'm going to do the same thing with matrix 2. I'm just going to go ahead and give it a couple of different settings based on some of the things that we've been looking at in the previous tutorials. Go ahead and set up my formatting, save the changes. You'll notice we're also shifting this one over 150 pixels inside this matrix. So not only are we doing some skewing and adjusting with it, again, making it active by changing the first value to 1, so that does, go ahead and undo that change, that does actually make this a valid active matrix. Go ahead and save the changes, refresh the browser window, and you'll see now that we've done just the opposite. We've actually skewed it in a different direction, and we've repositioned it inside of our browser window. Good time to pause if you want to type those in. Like our previous demonstrations, we actually do have fallback code that we can put inside these. It's very similar to what we've done here. I can actually take my fallback code for the first one. It's going to be -ms dash and then transform :matrix. Very similar to what we've been doing. And then I'm just going to go ahead and copy this here so we don't have to retype it all. It's going to have the same values in the parentheses, and this would be our fallback code for the Microsoft rendering engine for Internet Explorer. And again, the same thing. We have the same type of rendering for our WebKit engine for Safari. Save the changes, and that would be the fallback code for the Safari engine WebKit. So this is for Internet 9, Internet Explorer 9, and up until we get to 10, because in 10 we actually support the transform matrix syntax, the standard syntax. And then in Safari we'd actually use the WebKit transform. And that's still in use today because they still have not brought up their browser up to speed with some of the new CSS3 syntax. And again, like we demonstrated in previous exercises, this is currently in all available browsers other than Safari. So all the updated browsers support the matrix method. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to start now getting into the CSS3 3D transform methods. There are quite a few of those also. So in the next tutorial, we'll actually start the 3D transform methods with CSS3.